The wind howled outside, whipping frost across the windows of the quiet suburban street. Peter Hayes stood at his kitchen counter, carefully pouring 2 glasses of scotch. His hands were steady, but his mind churned like the storm outside. He glanced at the clock. 7:45 p.m. 15 minutes to go. The New Year's Eve party was modest, just a small gathering of 3. The idea of hosting a celebration had seemed ludicrous only a week ago. But Peter had thought better of wallowing in silence. Silence gave room for the memories, and the rage. His thoughts returned to the letter he'd found a month ago. A letter his wife, Emily, had carelessly left in the drawer of her vanity. In it, her affair with a co-worker, Alan, was laid bare. Every detail was seared into Peter's mind, but none more vividly than the final line. "I've never felt so alive." Peter clenched his jaw and gripped the counter until his knuckles turned white. Alive? Was that what her betrayal felt like? Had their 10 years of marriage left her numb, or had he simply not been enough? He was shaken from his thoughts by a knock at the door. Right on time. Straightening his shoulders, Peter moved to the entryway. When he opened the door, he found the figure of a tall, well-dressed man standing against the icy backdrop. Daniel Mercer, the new neighbor, exuded quiet charm. His tailored navy coat and silver scarf gave him the appearance of a man used to fine things. Yet there was a hollowness in his eyes, a vacancy that mirrored Peter's own. "Happy New Year's Eve," Daniel said with a faint smile. His voice was smooth, but it carried a weight of weariness. Peter stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Come in. You'll freeze out there." Daniel nodded, stepping into the warm glow of the house. He carried a modest bottle of wine and handed it to Peter. "I wasn't sure what to bring. I hope this will do." "It's perfect," Peter replied. "Make yourself comfortable." As Daniel peeled off his coat and scarf, Peter observed him more closely. The man looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not in the suburban sprawl of their neighborhood. His movements were measured, deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though he had learned to hide his unease behind a mask of confidence. Peter recognized the type, strong on the outside, fractured within. Daniel's move to the neighborhood had caused a ripple of speculation. Whispers at the local cafe suggested his wife had left him for another man, taking with her more than half of his hard-earned fortune. Peter hadn't pried, but he knew that such a wound left scars that no amount of wealth could soothe. "I appreciate the invitation," Daniel said, settling into an armchair by the fireplace. "It's been a long time since I've had company for the holidays." Peter set the glasses of scotch on the coffee table, taking the seat across from him. "New beginnings, right? This year's been a nightmare, but we've both got a clean slate ahead." Daniel raised his glass with a small, wry smile. "To clean slates, then." Their glasses clinked, the sound sharp against the soft crackle of the fire. For a moment, there was an air of camaraderie, 2 men bound by their unspoken pain. But Peter had invited Daniel for more than small talk. His plans for the evening ran far deeper than mere hospitality. Daniel took a sip of his drink, then leaned back in his chair. "I have to admit, I'm a little curious. I've barely unpacked, and I'm not exactly neighborly. What made you reach out?" Peter mirrored his casual posture, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He allowed a small, enigmatic smile to touch his lips. "I figured we might have a few things in common. Besides, no one should be alone tonight." Daniel studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of the statement. Then he nodded. "You're right about that." For a while, the 2 men exchanged pleasantries. They talked about their work, their homes, and the little quirks of the neighborhood. But as the hours passed, Peter carefully steered the conversation toward more personal territory. "You moved in so suddenly," Peter said, feigning casual interest. "If you don't mind me asking, what brought you here?" Daniel hesitated, his fingers tightening around the glass. He stared into the fire, the flickering flames reflected in his eyes. "I needed a change," he said finally. "My wife and I parted ways recently. The house felt too big without her, so I sold it. This place felt quiet." Peter leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but probing. I understand. My wife left too. Turns out, she preferred the company of someone else. The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, Daniel looked startled, as if Peter had said something too raw, too revealing. But then, to Peter's surprise, Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Seems like we're in the same boat, Daniel said, shaking his head. Isn't it ironic? You build a life with someone, invest everything you have, and they throw it away for a fling. Peter nodded, but his jaw tightened. Ironic. That's one word for it. They lapsed into silence, the weight of their shared experiences filling the room. But Peter's thoughts were far from idle. He watched Daniel carefully, measuring his responses, waiting for the right moment to tip the scales. This was no ordinary New Year's Eve. For Peter, it was the first step in a carefully calculated game. And Daniel Mercer had no idea he was about to become a pawn. The evening stretched on as the two men talked, their conversation moving like a chess match, each man revealing just enough to keep the other engaged. Peter steered the dialogue with practiced ease, nudging Daniel closer to the heart of his pain. You know, Daniel said after a long sip of scotch, it's strange to be sitting here. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined my life falling apart like this. He paused, his gaze distant. Celia, my ex-wife, was everything to me. We had our share of arguments, sure, but I never thought she'd walk away. Peter nodded slowly, his expression carefully composed. It's a shock when someone you trust betrays you. You start questioning everything, what you missed, what you could have done differently. Daniel's jaw tightened. Exactly. One day, you're building a life together. The next, you're reading an email she forgot to delete, and it hits you like a freight train. Peter's grip on his glass tightened. An email, huh? Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Yeah. She was careless, didn't even bother hiding it. It was a dinner reservation for two at some fancy place downtown. I thought it was for us at first, but then I checked the date. It was for the night I was out of town. Peter stayed silent, letting the story unravel. He could see the anger simmering beneath Daniel's calm exterior. The man's controlled demeanor was a mask, one Peter was determined to peel away. He leaned forward slightly, his tone soft but deliberate. And what happened after that? Did you confront her? Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. Not at first. I wanted to be sure, so I hired a private investigator. I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding, but it wasn't. A week later I had photos, receipts, and all the proof I needed. He stared into the fire, his voice dropping. She didn't even deny it. Just said she wasn't happy anymore. Peter's lips pressed into a thin line. He recognized the emptiness in Daniel's voice, the hollow despair of betrayal. But beneath it, he detected something else. A flicker of anger, of pride wounded too deeply to heal. Let me guess, Peter said quietly. She tried to justify it. Told you it wasn't your fault, but it wasn't hers either. Daniel looked up sharply, surprise flickering across his face. How did you know? Peter gave a wry smile, though his eyes remained cold. Because that's what they always say. My wife told me the same thing when I found her out. Said she didn't mean to hurt me, but she couldn't pretend anymore. Daniel's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a crack in his composed exterior. How do they do it? How do they throw away years like it's nothing? Peter let the question hang in the air. He knew the answer, but it wasn't one Daniel was ready to hear, not yet. Instead, he leaned back, swirling the remnants of scotch in his glass. You know what the worst part is? Peter said, his voice low and measured. It's not losing them. It's realizing they were never the person you thought they were. That the life you built together was a lie. Daniel's expression darkened, the weight of Peter's words sinking in. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Peter stood and crossed the room to refill their glasses. Another drink? Peter asked, his tone light, almost cheerful. The sudden shift in mood caught Daniel off guard, and he nodded. Sure. Why not? As Peter poured, he glanced at the clock. 10:15 p.m. Midnight was drawing closer, and with it, the culmination of his plan. He carried the glasses back to the living room, handing one to Daniel before taking his seat. "You know," Peter said, resuming their conversation, "I've been thinking a lot about second chances lately. Starting over. Do you believe in that?" Daniel hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I don't know. I mean, I want to, but it's hard to imagine starting fresh when you're still carrying so much baggage." Peter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It is hard. But sometimes, a clean slate isn't about forgetting the past. It's about facing it head-on and deciding what you're going to do with it." Daniel studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher the meaning behind his words. "What do you mean?" Peter smiled faintly, lifting his glass in a silent toast. "You'll see." The cryptic response left Daniel puzzled, but before he could press further, the sound of faint chimes echoed through the house. Peter's smile widened. "Perfect timing," he said, setting his glass down. "I almost forgot. I have something for us to celebrate properly." He rose from his chair and disappeared into the kitchen. Daniel watched him go, a flicker of unease creeping into his chest. There was something about Peter's demeanor that felt off, too composed, too deliberate. But before he could dwell on it, Peter returned, carrying a small wooden box. "What's that?" Daniel asked, eyeing the box warily. Peter set it on the coffee table with a flourish, his eyes gleaming. "A little surprise. I figured we could use something special to close out the year." He opened the box, revealing a sleek deck of cards and a small, elegant notebook. The sight of it made Daniel raise an eyebrow. "Cards?" he asked, half amused. Peter chuckled. "Not just any cards. It's a game, a tradition of sorts. Something I've been wanting to try for a long time." Daniel's unease deepened, but curiosity won out. "All right," he said slowly. "How does it work?" Peter's smile sharpened, a glint of something dangerous flashing in his eyes. "Don't worry. I'll explain everything." As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Daniel had no idea he was about to play a game he couldn't afford to lose. The tension in the room grew as Peter carefully laid out the cards. Each one had intricate, gilded designs on its back, catching the firelight in mesmerizing patterns. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued despite the knot forming in his stomach. "So," Daniel asked, his tone lighter than he felt, "what's the objective? Some kind of poker? Blackjack?" Peter shook his head, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. "Nothing quite so mundane. It's more personal than that, a storytelling game. Each card has a symbol, and that symbol represents a question or a scenario. The player who draws the card has to answer honestly or perform a corresponding task." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Sounds different." "It is," Peter replied, shuffling the deck with deliberate precision. "But it's cathartic. Sometimes, facing uncomfortable truths can be the best way to move forward." Daniel's unease deepened, but he masked it with a faint smile. "All right. I'm game. What's the catch?" Peter glanced up, his eyes glinting with a quiet intensity. "The only catch is honesty. No matter how difficult or unpleasant, you have to answer truthfully. Otherwise," he gestured to the notebook, "you forfeit, and I record your name in here as a coward." Daniel gave a dry laugh. "You really thought this through, didn't you?" Peter's expression remained unreadable. "Let's just say I've been waiting for the right person to play this with." The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine, but he forced himself to focus on the game. It was just cards, after all. How dangerous could it be? Peter dealt the first card, sliding it across the table toward Daniel. The gilded surface shimmered as Daniel picked it up. The front of the card displayed an image of a broken clock, its hands frozen at midnight. "What's this one mean?" Daniel asked, holding it up. Peter leaned back, his smile faint but sharp. "That's the turning point. It means you have to share the moment when everything in your life changed." Daniel hesitated, his grip tightening on the card. He had expected something trivial, something easy. Instead, the question cut straight to the heart of his pain. He glanced at Peter, whose gaze was steady, almost expectant. The moment everything changed. Daniel said slowly, his voice quiet. It was the night I found that email. I'd just landed after a long business trip. I was exhausted, looking forward to seeing Celia, and then I saw it. A confirmation for two at a restaurant we'd never been to. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, but deep down, I knew. Peter's expression didn't waver. What did you do? I confronted her a few days later, after I had proof. Daniel's jaw tightened as he stared into the flames. She didn't even fight me on it. She just packed her things and left. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire. Peter watched Daniel closely, noting the flicker of pain in his eyes. And how did it feel? Peter asked softly. Daniel looked up, startled by the question. How did it feel? Yes. Peter's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something darker. When she admitted it, when she left. How did it feel? Daniel hesitated, struggling to find the right words. It felt like I was being hollowed out. Like everything I'd worked for, everything I thought we were, was a lie. Peter nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he already knew. Then he picked up the deck and drew a card for himself. The image on the card was a snake coiled around a heart. The betrayal, Peter announced, his tone steady. Fitting, don't you think? Daniel frowned. What does that one mean? It means I have to share the deepest betrayal I've experienced, Peter said, his voice laced with a quiet bitterness. He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. It was about 6 weeks ago. I was cleaning the house, and I found a letter in my wife's vanity. A love letter written to someone else. It was explicit. Detailed. Daniel's eyebrows shot up. You didn't confront her? Oh, I did, Peter replied, his smile cold. But she didn't even bother denying it. She said she deserved to be happy, that I was too controlling, too predictable. He chuckled bitterly. I suppose I was predictable. I worked hard, provided for us, and trusted her implicitly. Fool that I was. Daniel nodded in sympathy, but something about Peter's tone made him uneasy. There was no heartbreak in his words, no sorrow, only a simmering rage, tightly contained. Peter set the card down and gestured for Daniel to draw another. Your turn. Daniel hesitated before reaching for the deck. He wasn't sure he liked where this was going, but curiosity, and perhaps a desire to bond with someone who understood his pain, kept him in the game. He drew a card with an image of two masks, one smiling and one frowning. Truth or lie, Peter explained. You have to share a lie you told someone close to you, and the truth behind it. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. A lie, huh? All right. I told Celia I was okay when she left. That I'd move on, that I didn't need her. And the truth? Peter asked, his gaze sharp. Daniel's voice dropped. The truth is, I wasn't okay. I spent weeks trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently. I wasn't sure I'd ever move on. Peter's smile returned, faint and enigmatic. Honest. I respect that. For the next hour, the game continued, each card peeling back layers of their lives. But with every question, Daniel felt a growing unease. Peter's questions were too precise, too personal. It was as if the game had been tailored to extract his deepest vulnerabilities. By the time the clock struck 11:30 p.m., Daniel had revealed more about himself than he ever intended. And yet, he still had no idea where this was leading. Peter, however, knew exactly where they were headed. The final card was waiting, and with it, the true purpose of the night would be revealed. The clock ticked relentlessly toward midnight. The tension in the room had grown thick, the friendly pretense between the two men dissolving as the game edged closer to something darker. Peter's steady gaze unnerved Daniel, but pride, and the unspoken challenge in Peter's demeanor, kept him seated. Daniel reached for the next card, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped it over. The card depicted a set of scales, perfectly balanced, with a single feather on one side and a dark stone on the other. Peter's smile widened, a spark of satisfaction lighting his eyes. Ah, the weight of justice. That's an important one. Daniel's brow furrowed. What does it mean? It means, Peter said, his voice calm and deliberate, that you must confess what justice would look like for the person who wronged you. No holding back. Daniel froze, the words landing like a punch to his chest. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated having to confront the anger he'd buried beneath a thin veneer of civility. He glanced at Peter, whose expression was expectant, almost eager. I don't know, Daniel said cautiously, setting the card down. I guess I just want her to feel what I felt. To understand the damage she caused. Peter leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. That's not justice. That's regret. Think deeper. What would it take to make her truly pay? Daniel hesitated, his stomach churning. He had spent weeks suppressing these thoughts, convincing himself he was better than the bitterness that threatened to consume him. But now, with Peter's unwavering gaze boring into him, the floodgates began to crack. I'd want her to lose what matters most, Daniel admitted quietly. To feel abandoned, betrayed. Like she doesn't matter. Peter nodded slowly, as if this were the answer he had been waiting for. That's more like it. Justice isn't about fairness, it's about balance. Evening the scales. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether he agreed. He reached for his drink, but his hand shook slightly as he brought it to his lips. And what about you? He asked, trying to deflect. What does justice look like for you? Peter didn't hesitate. Justice is about consequences. My wife thought she could betray me and walk away unscathed. She thought I'd roll over and accept it. But she was wrong. Daniel frowned. What are you saying? Peter's smile was chilling, devoid of warmth. I'm saying that justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you take. The words sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He set his glass down, suddenly uneasy. You mean revenge? Peter tilted his head, considering the word. Revenge is an emotional reaction. Justice is measured, deliberate. It restores balance. Before Daniel could respond, Peter picked up the deck and shuffled it one final time. Then he slid the top card across the table, leaving it face down. He tapped the back of the card with 2 fingers. This is it, Peter said, his voice soft but charged with tension. The last card. The one that decides everything. Daniel stared at the card, his instincts screaming at him to leave the game unfinished. But he couldn't back down now, not with Peter watching him like a predator waiting to strike. He reached for the card, his hand trembling as he turned it over. The card showed a shattered mirror, its shards catching the light in jagged patterns. The reflection, Peter said, his voice low and almost reverent. The most important card of all. Daniel swallowed hard. What does it mean? Peter's smile faded, his expression hardening. It means you have to face the truth about yourself, your role in what happened. Every betrayal has 2 sides, Daniel. This is your chance to admit your own. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on Daniel like a weight. He wanted to argue, to protest that he wasn't to blame for what Celia had done. But as he stared at the card, a bitter truth gnawed at the edges of his mind. I wasn't perfect, Daniel said haltingly. I worked long hours, traveled constantly. I thought providing for her was enough, but I wasn't really there. I ignored the signs because it was easier than facing them. Peter's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. So you admit you played a part in her unhappiness? Daniel nodded reluctantly. Yes. But that doesn't excuse what she did. No, it doesn't. Peter agreed, his voice cold. But understanding your role is the first step toward reclaiming control. Daniel frowned, confused by Peter's sudden shift in tone. What are you trying to say? Peter stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He retrieved the wooden box and placed it back on the table. Then he reached inside and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He held it out to Daniel. What's this? Daniel asked, his stomach tightening with unease. Open it, Peter said simply. With trembling hands, Daniel unfolded the paper. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words scrawled across it. Alan Peterson, December 23, 10:42 p.m. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Alan Peterson? That's Emily's lover. Peter finished coldly. Or should I say, was her lover. The weight of Peter's words hit Daniel like a thunderclap. He stared at the name on the paper, his mind racing. What did you do? Peter's smile returned, sharper than ever. I took justice into my own hands. Alan thought he could steal my wife and get away with it. But now he knows what betrayal feels like. Just like Emily will. Daniel's blood ran cold as the realization sank in. This wasn't a game, it was a reckoning. And Peter wasn't done yet. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the note in his hands. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of his vision blurring as Peter's words echoed in his mind. Alan Peterson, December 23, 10:42 p.m. The date was recent, barely a week ago. The weight of what Peter was implying began to suffocate him. You're joking. Daniel stammered, though his voice was hollow. This is a sick joke, right? Peter tilted his head, his expression calm but unyielding. Does it sound like I'm joking? Daniel dropped the note onto the table as though it burned him. He leaned back, his body tense, his instincts screaming at him to leave. You can't be serious. You're saying you, what? Hurt him? Killed him? Peter didn't flinch. I did what needed to be done. The words were delivered with chilling finality, each one landing like a hammer blow. Peter leaned forward, his eyes locked on Daniel's, his voice calm but laced with menace. Alan destroyed my marriage. He thought he could take what was mine and walk away. But actions have consequences, Daniel. He learned that the hard way. Daniel shot to his feet, his pulse roaring in his ears. You're insane. This isn't justice. It's murder. Peter remained seated, utterly unperturbed by Daniel's outburst. Calm down. You're overreacting. Overreacting? Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. You just admitted to. He stopped himself, his mind spinning. I don't want to hear this. I don't want any part of this. Peter rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression unchanging. He gestured toward the seat Daniel had vacated. Sit down. Daniel hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the unnerving sense that Peter wouldn't let him leave so easily. I don't think that's a good idea. I insist, Peter said, his voice icy. We're not done yet. The room seemed to close in on Daniel as he reluctantly sat down. Peter loomed over him for a moment before returning to his own seat. He picked up his glass, his demeanor eerily composed, as if they were discussing nothing more significant than the weather. You think I'm a monster, Peter said finally, his tone even. But tell me something, Daniel. When you sat here tonight, confessing your anger, your bitterness, your desire to see Celia suffer, didn't you feel a spark of satisfaction? Daniel didn't respond, his jaw tightening. Peter leaned forward, his eyes boring into Daniel's. Be honest with yourself. You wanted justice too. You still do. That's not the same. Daniel snapped, his voice shaking. Thinking about it, wishing for it, it's not the same as actually doing it. Peter shrugged, unbothered. It's not so different. The only thing that separates us is action. I acted, Daniel. You've spent weeks wallowing in self-pity, but I took control of my situation. Daniel shook his head, his stomach churning. You're sick. What about the police? Did you even think about what happens next? Peter smiled faintly, as if amused by the question. You're assuming they'll find anything. Alan's disappearance will remain just that, a disappearance. I was thorough. The casual confidence in Peter's tone sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He felt trapped, and snared in a web he hadn't realized was being spun around him all evening. What do you want from me? Daniel asked finally, his voice low and strained. Why tell me all this? Peter's smile widened, his eyes glinting with a predatory edge. Because I see potential in you. You're angry, hurt, just like I was. But you're still clinging to the idea that you're powerless. I'm offering you a chance to change that. Daniel stared at him, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? Peter reached into the wooden box again and pulled out another slip of paper. He slid it across the table, and Daniel's blood ran cold as he read the name written there, Celia Mercer. You want justice, don't you? Peter said, his voice smooth as silk. Here's your opportunity. Daniel recoiled, shoving the paper back toward Peter as though it were toxic. You're insane. You think I'm going to, what? Hurt her? Kill her? No. Absolutely not. Peter didn't react to Daniel's outburst. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze steady. Think about it. She betrayed you, humiliated you. She deserves to feel the same pain she inflicted on you. No, Daniel said firmly, shaking his head. I'm not like you. Peter smirked, a hint of condescension in his expression. Not yet. Daniel rose to his feet again, his hands clenched into fists. I'm done here. Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, I want no part of it. Peter stood as well, his demeanor calm but unrelenting. You can walk away if you want. But ask yourself this, can you really let her get away with it? Can you live with the knowledge that she destroyed your life and faced no consequences? Daniel didn't respond. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, fear, guilt, and a dangerous flicker of something darker. He turned and strode toward the door, grabbing his coat as Peter's voice followed him. You'll come around, Peter said softly. Sooner or later, you'll realize I'm right. Daniel didn't look back. He slammed the door behind him and stepped into the freezing night, his breath clouding in the frigid air. But as he walked away, Peter's words echoed in his mind, insidious and unshakable. The icy wind bit at Daniel's face as he walked home, his mind racing. The quiet neighborhood was deserted, the glow of holiday lights casting an eerie warmth over the snow-covered lawns. Peter's words churned in his head, each one a jagged splinter lodging itself deeper into his thoughts. Justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you take. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to shake the echoes of Peter's voice. The man was clearly unhinged, dangerous even. And yet, as much as Daniel wanted to dismiss everything he'd heard, he couldn't deny the spark of recognition that had flared during their conversation. Peter's anger mirrored his own, his desire for vengeance a dark reflection of the thoughts Daniel had tried to suppress. Reaching his house, Daniel let himself in and leaned against the door, exhaling heavily. The quiet hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the hallway clock only heightened his unease. The bottle of wine he'd brought to Peter sat on the counter, untouched. He grabbed it, uncorked it with shaky hands, and poured himself a glass. Sinking into the worn leather armchair in his living room, Daniel stared into the fire crackling in the hearth. His thoughts turned to Celia, as they so often did. He pictured her laugh, her smile, the way she used to look at him before everything fell apart. Then the image shifted, replaced by the cold indifference on her face when she told him she wasn't happy anymore. I didn't mean to hurt you, Daniel. But I need more than this. More than you. Her words had gutted him, left him raw and exposed. He'd spent weeks agonizing over what he could have done differently, replaying every moment of their marriage like a broken record. But Peter had forced him to confront something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Celia's betrayal wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. A deliberate decision to break their vows, to destroy the life they had built together. Daniel took a long sip of wine, the bitterness on his tongue matching the turmoil in his chest. He told himself he wouldn't let Peter's poison take root, but doubts began to creep in like shadows. What if Peter was right? What if justice was something you had to seize for yourself? He shook his head, setting the glass down with a thud. No. He wasn't like Peter. He wouldn't let himself be consumed by revenge. But as the hours stretched into the early morning, Daniel found himself staring at the name Peter had written, Celia Mercer. The paper was gone, but the name burned in his memory, refusing to fade. The next day, Daniel tried to go about his routine as if nothing had happened. He went for a run, shoveled the driveway, and answered a few work emails. But the tension in his chest remained, a dull ache that refused to dissipate. Around noon, just as he was finishing lunch, there was a knock at the door. Daniel frowned, setting his fork down. He wasn't expecting anyone. Pulling the door open, he was greeted by Peter, who stood on the porch holding a covered dish. "Peter," Daniel said, his voice betraying his surprise. "What are you doing here?" Peter smiled faintly, his demeanor as calm as ever. "I realized I never thanked you properly for inviting me over last night. Thought I'd return the favor." Daniel's instincts screamed at him to shut the door, but politeness, and a lingering curiosity, made him step aside. Sure. Come in." Peter entered, his gaze sweeping over the tidy living room. He set the dish on the counter and turned to face Daniel. "I hope I didn't overwhelm you last night. I can be intense, I know. That's one way to put it," Daniel muttered, folding his arms. Peter chuckled softly. "I don't blame you for being skeptical. What I told you, it's not an easy thing to hear. But I meant what I said. You have the power to take control of your life, Daniel. You just have to be willing to act." Daniel bristled, his unease flaring into irritation. "I told you I'm not like you. I'm not going to hurt anyone." Peter's expression didn't change. "You say that now. But let me ask you something. When you think about Celia, when you think about what she did to you, can you honestly say you've forgiven her?" Daniel hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Forgiveness? The idea seemed laughable. He hadn't forgiven Celia, and he doubted he ever would. But that didn't mean he wanted revenge, did it? "I don't need to forgive her," Daniel said finally. "But I'm not going to stoop to her level." Peter nodded slowly, as if considering his response. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He placed it on the counter, his movements deliberate. "What's that?" Daniel asked warily. "Something to think about," Peter replied cryptically. "When you're ready, open it. You'll know what to do." Daniel stared at the envelope as if it might bite him. "I don't want it." "You don't have to," Peter said, stepping toward the door. "But one way or another, you'll have to decide what kind of man you want to be." With that, Peter left, the door clicking shut behind him. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the envelope on the counter. It seemed innocuous enough, just a plain white envelope, unmarked and unassuming. But he couldn't shake the feeling that opening it would change everything. He reached for it, then stopped, his hand hovering inches above the surface. His breath came in shallow bursts as he debated what to do. Finally, he snatched the envelope and shoved it into the drawer of his desk, slamming it shut. Out of sight, but not out of mind. For the next 2 days, Daniel tried to focus on his work, throwing himself into spreadsheets and emails in a desperate attempt to quiet his mind. But the envelope Peter had left loomed like a shadow over everything. Each time he passed his desk, his gaze drifted toward the drawer where it was hidden, his curiosity warring with his unease. By the third evening, the weight became unbearable. Sitting at his desk, Daniel stared at the drawer, his fingers drumming against the wood. He told himself not to open it, that nothing good could come of indulging Peter's twisted games. But the questions wouldn't stop circling in his mind. What's inside? What if it's nothing? What if it's something I need to know? Finally, with a frustrated sigh, Daniel yanked the drawer open and retrieved the envelope. His heart pounded as he tore it open, pulling out a single photograph. The image made his stomach drop. It was Celia, sitting at an outdoor cafe. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her smile radiant. Across from her sat a man Daniel didn't recognize, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with sandy hair and an easy grin. The two of them looked entirely at ease, their body language intimate in a way that made Daniel's chest ache. On the back of the photo, a date and time were scrawled in Peter's neat handwriting, December 29th, 12:30 p.m. Daniel stared at the picture, his emotions a volatile mix of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. He knew Celia had moved on, but seeing it captured so plainly brought the pain rushing back like a fresh wound. Who is he? Daniel wondered bitterly. Another man she could discard when it suited her? The thought festered, and before long, he found himself reaching for his phone. He hesitated, then dialed Peter's number. The call was answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," Peter said, his tone calm and knowing. "What the hell is this?" Daniel demanded, gripping the photo tightly. "Why did you give this to me?" Peter didn't miss a beat. "Because you needed to see it. You've been clinging to the past, Daniel, clinging to her. It's time to face reality." Daniel paced the room, his voice rising. "And what am I supposed to do with this, huh? Sit around stewing in anger? I told you I'm not like you." Peter's voice remained steady, unruffled. "You're more like me than you think. And that's not a bad thing. Anger isn't your enemy, Daniel, it's your motivation. But you have to decide how to use it." Daniel stopped pacing, his breathing heavy. "You think I'm just going to go after her? Like you did with Alan?" "I'm not telling you to do anything," Peter replied smoothly. "I'm just giving you the tools. What you do with them is up to you." Daniel wanted to argue, to lash out, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, a part of him recognized the truth in Peter's statement. He ended the call without another word, tossing the phone onto the couch. That night, Daniel barely slept. His dreams were filled with fragmented images: Celia's laughter, the stranger's face, Peter's cold smile. When he finally woke, groggy and disoriented, the first thing he saw was the photograph sitting on his nightstand. He didn't remember putting it there. He spent the morning in a fog, his thoughts looping endlessly. By midday, he found himself sitting in his car, the photograph clutched in his hand. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he intended to do. All he knew was that he needed answers. The cafe in the photo was easy to recognize, a trendy spot downtown that Celia had always loved. Daniel parked across the street, his heart racing as he scanned the outdoor seating area. It was empty now, the tables covered in frost, but the sight of it brought the photograph to life in vivid detail. "What am I doing here?" Daniel asked himself, gripping the steering wheel. He wanted to believe he was just looking for closure, but the truth felt murkier. He was here because Peter had planted the seed, and now it was growing, feeding on his resentment. As he sat there, wrestling with his thoughts, a familiar figure emerged from the cafe. Celia. She was bundled in a gray coat, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She didn't notice Daniel's car as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her phone pressed to her ear. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched her walk away, oblivious to his presence. For a moment, he considered getting out of the car, confronting her, demanding answers. But then he remembered Peter's words: "You have to decide what kind of man you want to be." He stayed frozen in his seat, the photograph crumpled in his hand. He didn't know what kind of man he was anymore, but he was starting to fear the answer. Daniel didn't leave his car for hours. He sat there, staring at the cafe long after Celia had disappeared from sight. His thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, guilt, and frustration. The photograph in his hand seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of the life he'd lost. When he finally drove home, the day had melted into evening. The quiet house greeted him with its usual emptiness, but something felt different now. Peter's words had burrowed deep, fueling a storm he couldn't ignore. The photograph still sat in his pocket. He pulled it out and stared at Celia's laughing face, the stranger beside her. His jaw tightened. Was this her fresh start? A new beginning built on the ruins of their marriage? Daniel set the photo on the counter and poured himself a drink. He couldn't stop replaying the conversation with Peter in his head. Justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you take. But was that justice, or just Peter's twisted rationalization? The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. He hesitated before picking it up. "Hello? It's me," Peter said, his voice calm, almost casual. Daniel's stomach tightened. "What do you want?" "Just checking in," Peter replied. "I assume you've seen the photo by now." "I have," Daniel said sharply. "And I don't know what you're trying to do, but I'm not part of it." Peter chuckled softly. "Not yet. But you called me, didn't you? You're curious. You want answers." Daniel clenched his fist. I don't need you to tell me how to feel, Peter. No, but I can show you what to do with it, Peter said. You think sitting at home, stewing in anger, is going to help? That's what I used to think too. But you know as well as I do, it won't. You need action. Daniel's chest burned with frustration. You're insane. I don't know why I ever listened to you. Peter sighed, his tone shifting to something colder. Because you know I'm right. You're angry, Daniel. You're hurt. And deep down, you want to see her suffer. Don't deny it. Daniel hung up, slamming the phone onto the counter. The conversation left him shaking, his emotions running wild. He wanted to dismiss Peter as a lunatic, but his words had struck a nerve. That night, Daniel barely slept. The photograph sat on his nightstand like an accusation, and his dreams were plagued with images of Celia and the stranger, laughing at his expense. When morning came, he was no closer to finding peace. By the following week, Daniel's resolve began to waver. He found himself replaying his last encounter with Celia, dissecting her words, searching for hidden truths. The memory of her betrayal felt fresh again, raw and consuming. He couldn't stop thinking about the man in the photograph. Who was he? How long had they been together? Did Celia feel the same spark with him that she once claimed to feel with Daniel? These thoughts consumed him, and before he knew it, Daniel found himself back at the cafe. It had become an obsession, watching, waiting, hoping to find answers he wasn't sure he wanted. On the third visit, he saw her. Celia was seated outside, bundled in a coat, her hair catching the winter sun. She wasn't alone. The man from the photograph sat across from her, his expression warm and attentive. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he watched them. They laughed, their conversation animated, their connection undeniable. The sight made something inside him snap. Without thinking, Daniel stepped out of the car. His footsteps crunched in the snow as he approached the cafe, his pulse hammering in his ears. But as he drew closer, he hesitated. Confronting them here, in public, wouldn't accomplish anything. He turned and walked away, his mind racing. The anger he felt wasn't just directed at Celia or the stranger, it was at himself. For his passivity, his inability to move on. Peter's voice echoed in his head, taunting him with the truth he didn't want to face. That evening, Daniel found himself dialing Peter's number again. I need to know something, Daniel said the moment Peter picked up. I'm listening, Peter replied, his tone calm and measured. How far did you go? Daniel asked, his voice trembling. With Alan. What exactly did you do? Peter paused, and for a moment, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. But then Peter spoke, his voice steady. I made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. He thought he was untouchable, that he could destroy lives without consequence. I showed him otherwise. Daniel swallowed hard. And you're fine with that? With what you did? Peter's laugh was low, almost amused. Fine? No. But I sleep better knowing he paid the price for what he did to me. Daniel's hand tightened around the phone. And you think I should do the same? I think you should stop lying to yourself, Peter said. You want justice, Daniel. But only you can decide what that looks like. Over the next few days, Daniel felt himself slipping further. He avoided his usual routines, consumed by thoughts of Celia and the man in the photograph. His emotions oscillated between anger and despair, leaving him exhausted and hollow. He stopped answering calls from friends and family, isolating himself in the quiet of his home. Peter's words played on a loop in his mind, goading him toward a decision he wasn't ready to make. Late one night, unable to sleep, Daniel opened the drawer where he'd kept the photograph. He stared at it for a long time, his thoughts spiraling. Then, almost mechanically, he grabbed his coat and keys. The drive to Celia's house was a blur. By the time Daniel arrived, the streets were empty, and her house was dark. He sat in his car, staring at the windows, his breath fogging the glass. What was he doing here? What did he hope to accomplish? The questions swirled in his mind, but before he could answer them, the front door opened. Celia stepped out, her expression startled when she saw him. Daniel? she said, her voice tinged with confusion. What are you doing here? I needed to talk, Daniel said, his voice unsteady. Now? Celia glanced at her watch. It's late. Yeah, well, so is finding out you moved on so quickly, Daniel snapped before he could stop himself. Celia's expression darkened. Is that what this is about? Daniel, I don't owe you an explanation. We're over. Over? Daniel's voice rose. We had 10 years, Celia. 10 years, and you threw it away for him. Celia's face hardened. I didn't throw anything away, Daniel. I needed more than you could give me. I'm sorry if that hurts, but it's the truth. Daniel stood there, his chest heaving, the weight of her words suffocating him. Back in his car, Daniel sat motionless for what felt like hours. Celia's words echoed in his mind, but so did Peter's. He had come here seeking closure, but all he'd found was the same emptiness that had haunted him for months. He thought of Peter, of the promises he'd made, the dark path he'd followed in search of justice. Was that what Daniel wanted for himself? Was he willing to let anger consume him completely? As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Daniel made his decision. He wouldn't let Peter's darkness claim him. With a trembling hand, Daniel pulled out his phone and blocked Peter's number. Then he tore the photograph in half and tossed it out the window. It wasn't closure, but it was a start. For the first time in months, Daniel felt like he could breathe again. The path ahead would be long and difficult, but it was his to walk. And he would walk it alone. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.